The scorching Texas badlands of 1882 held death in every shadow. But what ranch hand Jake Sullivan discovered crying beneath a mesquite tree on that blistering August afternoon would shatter the boundaries between sworn enemies. A Comanche infant, barely alive and abandoned in the dust after a cavalry raid, lay wrapped in bloodstained beadwork that spoke of desperate flight and unimaginable loss. What Jake chose to do in those critical hours, defying territorial law and risking execution for harboring a native child, would bring an entire Comanche band to his doorstep under the cover of darkness. His act of humanity toward an innocent life would forge bonds that frontier hatred had declared impossible when Chief White Eagle arrived with the child's mother, whose tears of gratitude would transform enemies into family. Chapter 1. Discovery in the Dust. The Texas Badlands of August 1882 stretched before Jake Sullivan like a vision of hell itself, where the scorching sun had transformed the landscape into a wasteland of cracked earth and dying vegetation. At 28 years old, Jake had survived 5 brutal summers working cattle across the unforgiving terrain of West Texas, but this drought surpassed anything in territorial memory. The temperature soared past 110 degrees by midday, creating heat mirages that danced across the horizon like ghostly apparitions, warning travelers of nature's lethal indifference. Jake guided his exhausted horse through a ravine that once held a flowing creek, now reduced to nothing more than sun-baked clay, bearing the skeletal remains of fish that had perished weeks earlier. His primary responsibility involved checking the scattered waterholes where the ranch's remaining cattle gathered, desperate creatures whose ribs showed through their hides as they struggled against starvation. The Diamond Cross Ranch had already lost over 300 head to the merciless drought, and Jake's daily patrols had become grim tallies of death rather than the livestock management he had originally been hired to perform. The mesquite trees that dotted the landscape provided the only shade in this desolate expanse, their thorny branches somehow maintaining life despite conditions that had killed everything else. Jake dismounted near a cluster of these hardy survivors to rest his horse and take a precious sip from his dwindling water supply when a sound cut through the oppressive silence that made his blood run cold. The unmistakable cry of an infant echoed from somewhere among the thorny shadows, a sound so unexpected in this remote location that Jake initially dismissed it as a heat-induced hallucination. The crying continued with the desperate persistence of genuine distress, leading Jake to investigate despite his rational mind insisting that no child could possibly exist in this deadly wilderness. What he discovered beneath the largest mesquite tree would haunt him for the remainder of his days. A Comanche infant, perhaps 6 months old, lay wrapped in a beautifully beaded cradleboard that bore dark stains Jake immediately recognized as dried blood. The child's face showed signs of severe dehydration, her lips cracked and eyes sunken, yet she possessed enough strength to maintain the cries that had attracted his attention. Evidence surrounding the abandoned infant told a story of violence and desperate flight that Jake pieced together with the tracking skills necessity had taught him. Horse tracks from cavalry mounts marked the soft dust and patterns indicating rapid pursuit, while scattered items of Comanche origin suggested a camp that had been struck with military precision. Shell casings from Spencer-repeating rifles glinted in the harsh sunlight, their brass surfaces telling tales of the running battle that had passed through this area perhaps 2 days earlier. The mother's moccasin prints revealed her final desperate act of love, circling the mesquite tree multiple times as she clearly struggled with the impossible decision to leave her child. Jake could read her agony in the disturbed earth where she had knelt, probably nursing the infant one last time before placing her in the shadiest spot available. The beadwork on the cradleboard represented months of careful craftsmanship, its intricate patterns identifying the child as belonging to a family of considerable standing within Comanche society. Jake understood the enormous risk that saving this child represented in the current political climate of territorial Texas. Recent Comanche raids had inflamed settler hatred to murderous levels, with vigilante groups executing anyone suspected of providing aid to native peoples. The Texas Rangers maintained standing orders to remove all Comanche presence from the region, their interpretation of removal often involving bullets rather than relocation. Harboring a Comanche infant could result in Jake's immediate execution without trial, his body left hanging as a warning to other potential sympathizers. Yet something in the infant's dark eyes spoke to Jake's humanity in ways that transcended racial hatred and political expedience. This child bore no responsibility for the complex web of violence that had consumed the Texas frontier, her only crime being birth into a world that denied her people's right to exist. Jake made his decision with the full knowledge that it might cost him everything, carefully lifting the cradle board and securing it to his saddle for the dangerous journey back to his isolated cabin. Chapter 2. Forbidden Mercy. Jake's isolated cabin on the northern edge of the Diamond Cross Ranch became a sanctuary of secrets as he struggled to keep the Comanche infant alive through those first critical days. The single-room structure, built from rough-hewn logs and sealed with mud against the desert winds, had never been intended as a nursery, yet Jake transformed it with desperate ingenuity born from necessity. He fashioned a makeshift cradle from an empty ammunition crate, lining it with his softest blankets while positioning it away from the window where curious eyes might glimpse his dangerous ward. The challenge of feeding an infant without proper supplies tested every ounce of Jake's frontier resourcefulness. His initial attempts with diluted canned milk resulted in violent rejection, the baby's system unable to process the unfamiliar substance after days of starvation. Remembering stories from Army Scouts about native feeding practices, Jake rode, under the cover of darkness, to a neighboring ranch where he secretly milked a goat, knowing that this gentler substitute might prove more digestible for the weakened child. The theft of milk became a nightly ritual, each expedition risking discovery that would mean death for both himself and the infant. Jake learned through trial and painful error how to interpret the baby's different cries, distinguishing hunger from discomfort, exhaustion from illness. He discovered that singing softly in the monotonous tones he used for calming spooked cattle seemed to soothe her restless periods, though he suspected his rough voice bore little resemblance to the Comanche lullabies she had known. The child's fever spikes during those early nights forced Jake to tear strips from his only good shirt, soaking them in precious water to cool her burning skin while praying to whatever power might listen that she would survive until morning. The arrival of Tom Brennan at Jake's cabin 3 days after the rescue nearly exposed everything. The foreman appeared unannounced to discuss moving the remaining cattle to better grazing, his unexpected presence forcing Jake to hastily conceal the cradle board beneath a pile of horse blankets. Throughout Brennan's visit, the infant remained miraculously silent. Though Jake's heart pounded with such force, he felt certain the foreman must hear it. Brennan commented on Jake's haggard appearance and the unusual orderliness of the typically chaotic bachelor quarters, observations that Jake deflected by attributing both to the stress of losing so many cattle. Texas Rangers passed within 100 yards of the cabin on the 5th day, their patrol following reports of Comanche scouts seen in the area. Jake watched from his doorway as the 6 heavily armed men watered their horses at his well, their casual discussion of the recent massacre chilling his blood as they described finding bodies at a destroyed camp 15 miles south. Captain Reynolds mentioned a missing infant among the casualties, speculating that coyotes had likely dragged the body away, never imagining that the child lay, sleeping merely yards from where he stood. The baby's health deteriorated dramatically on the 7th night, her breathing becoming labored while her skin developed an alarming grayish pallor that Jake recognized as approaching death. Desperation drove him to remember fragments of medical knowledge gleaned from watching the Army surgeon at Fort Griffin treat children during a fever outbreak. He created a steam tent using boiled water and blankets, holding the infant in the humid air while massaging her tiny chest to encourage deeper breathing. The treatment consumed his entire water reserve, leaving nothing for himself or his horse. But Jake continued the exhausting process through the night. Morning brought the miracle of improved breathing and the return of healthy color to the child's cheeks, though Jake understood that his amateur medical efforts had merely postponed rather than prevented the crisis. The infant required proper nutrition and care that his limited resources couldn't provide indefinitely. He began formulating desperate plans to somehow deliver the child to reservation authorities, though he knew such attempts would likely result in her death through official channels that showed little mercy for Comanche survivors. Jake found himself trapped between impossible choices, each passing day increasing both his attachment to the child and the likelihood of discovery that would destroy them both. Chapter 3. The Mother's Search. Across the scorched expanse of the Texas Badlands, Chief White Eagle led his band of surviving Comanche through a landscape transformed into a graveyard of their people's dreams. The cavalry attack 8 days earlier had scattered a tribe like seeds thrown to a harsh wind, leaving families torn apart and ancient bonds severed by American bullets. 23 warriors accompanied their chief through dangerous territory now patrolled by Texas Rangers eager to complete the extermination that had begun at the massacre site. Yet their mission transcended mere survival into something far more sacred. Mourning Dove, a young mother whose world had collapsed when she left her infant daughter beneath the mesquite tree, rode alongside the chief with eyes that held no tears left to shed. Her grief had transformed into something harder than the desert rocks, a determination that pushed her beyond physical exhaustion into a realm where only maternal desperation could sustain life. The other women whispered that she had neither eaten nor slept properly since the abandonment, her existence reduced to a single burning purpose that consumed everything else like prairie fire. The band's medicine man, Sleeping Wolf, had performed sacred ceremonies each night despite the danger of detection, calling upon spiritual forces to reveal the infant's fate through visions and signs. His dreams spoke of contradictions that puzzled even his considerable wisdom. Images of white hands providing gentle care, of cow's milk transformed into sustenance, of danger and salvation intertwined like braided rope. The spirits insisted the child lived, but remained frustratingly vague about her precise location, offering only fragments that required earthly investigation to complete. Chief White Eagle's scouts possessed tracking abilities that seemed supernatural to white observers, but represented generations of accumulated knowledge passed from father to son through practical teaching. They could read stories and disturb pebbles that others wouldn't even notice, interpret the meaning of bird flight patterns that indicated human presence, and detect the faintest traces of smoke from cooking fires miles before visibility should have allowed such perception. These skills are now focused entirely on following the cold trail from where Mourning Dove had left her daughter, searching for any sign of the child's subsequent fate. The tracker, named Red Sky, discovered crucial evidence on the 10th day of searching, marks in the dust that told of a lone rider approaching the mesquite tree from the north rather than from the cavalry's eastern path. Boot prints rather than moccasins, spurs that marked him as a cowboy rather than a soldier, and most tellingly, signs that he had carefully lifted something from beneath the tree before departing. The trail led toward ranch lands that represented death for any Comanche who ventured there. Yet Red Sky's certainty that these tracks held answers pushed the band forward despite the enormous risks. Sleeping Wolf's visions grew more intense as they approached the boundaries of the Diamond Cross Ranch, his dreams filled with images of a young white man whose heart contained unexpected mercy. The medicine man saw the infant wrapped in rough blankets rather than traditional rabbit fur, heard her cries soothed by unfamiliar songs that nonetheless carried genuine care, and most remarkably, witnessed spiritual protection surrounding both the child and her unlikely guardian. These visions suggested intervention by forces that transcended human understanding, purposes that neither Comanche nor white civilization fully comprehended. Mourning Dove's desperate hope battled against probability as the band made camp in hidden canyons during daylight while conducting their search under the cover of darkness. She knew the statistics of survival for an abandoned infant in this brutal landscape approached zero, yet her mother's instinct insisted with fierce certainty that her daughter lived. Every night, she sang the traditional songs that had once lulled her baby to sleep, her voice carrying across the desert wind in the hopes that somehow, somewhere, her child might hear and remember. Chief White Eagle faced the terrible decision of how much longer to risk his surviving people in this search for one infant, knowing that each day increased the likelihood of discovery by ranger patrols that would show no mercy. Yet he also understood that Mourning Dove's child represented more than a single life. She embodied the future itself, the next generation that would carry Comanche blood and memory forward through whatever dark times awaited. The chief prepared his warriors for one final reconnaissance of the ranch lands, sensing that their quest approached its conclusion, whether in triumph or ultimate sorrow. Chapter 4. Midnight Reunion. The August moon hung like a silver dollar above Jake's cabin when the Comanche warriors materialized from the darkness with the fluid silence of shadows given human form. Jake had been tending the infant through another difficult night when his horse's nervous whinnying alerted him to their presence, though by then 20 warriors had already positioned themselves in a perfect circle around his modest dwelling. Their appearance seemed less like arrival than manifestation, as if the desert itself had birthed them from dust and starlight to reclaim what belonged to their people. Chief White Eagle emerged from the circle of warriors with the measured dignity of someone who had witnessed enough death to value every living moment. His weathered face bore paint that transformed his features into something both terrible and magnificent in the moonlight, while eagle feathers in his gray-streaked hair moved with supernatural grace in the still air. Behind him walked a figure whose presence made Jake's blood freeze, a young woman whose hollow eyes and gaunt features marked her as someone consumed by grief beyond ordinary human endurance. Mourning Dove stood at the threshold of Jake's cabin like an apparition of maternal anguish, her trembling hands extended toward the door as if she could feel her child's presence through the rough-hewn logs. The weeks of searching had carved away everything except desperate hope from her face, leaving behind features that seemed sculpted from sorrow itself. She spoke no English, but the universal language of a mother's plea needed no translation as her eyes met Jake's through the window with an intensity that pierced his soul. Jake understood that his next actions would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Yet fear seemed insignificant compared to the moral weight of this moment. He slowly opened the door, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening while maintaining eye contact with Chief White Eagle. Without words, he stepped aside and gestured toward the makeshift cradle where the infant lay sleeping, her tiny chest rising and falling with a healthy rhythm that had seemed impossible just days earlier. The sound that escaped Mourning Dove's throat when she saw her daughter transcended mere human expression, containing within it all the anguish of separation and explosive joy of reunion that language could never adequately convey. She collapsed beside the ammunition crate cradle with trembling hands that seemed afraid to touch the child, as if contact might shatter this dream into cruel reality. When she finally gathered the infant against her chest, her tears fell like summer rain on the baby's face, each drop a blessing that washed away the nightmare of their separation. Chief White Eagle's stern expression softened as he witnessed the reunion, his warriors' bearing momentarily replaced by something profoundly human that recognized mercy beyond tribal boundaries. Through broken English supplemented by expressive gestures, he communicated his understanding of Jake's actions, how this white rancher had risked execution to save a Comanche child, asking nothing in return except the infant's survival. Such behavior defied everything the chief had learned about white settlers through decades of bitter conflict, yet the evidence lay before him in his niece's living flesh. The ceremony that followed transformed Jake from enemy to brother with rituals older than memory, conducted there in his simple cabin while warriors stood guard against ranger patrols. Mourning Dove placed a necklace of sacred beads around Jake's neck with hands that still trembled from emotion, each bead representing prayers for his protection that would follow him through whatever years remained. Chief White Eagle presented him with a war lance that had belonged to his own brother, fallen in battle years before, signifying that Jake now held the status of family within the band. As dawn approached, the chief performed a final blessing that sealed Jake's adoption into the tribe, marking his forehead with sacred paint that would identify him as Comanche to any band he might encounter. The message was clear through gestures and ceremony. Jake had given life when others brought only death, and through his mercy, the child would bridge two worlds. When peace finally came to the frontier, she would carry the memory of compassion that transcended racial hatred. The band vanished into the desert as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Jake standing alone with tears streaming down his weathered face, understanding that his simple act of humanity had bridged two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. If Jake's courage in saving an innocent life moved you, hit subscribe for more legendary frontier stories. Would you have risked everything to save that baby? Comment bilo?